There is a small town in East Texas called Tatum. Most people have never heard of it, and honestly, most people never will. It sits quietly in a place called Rusk County. Wide open land, tall pine trees, and long stretches of nothing between one house and the next. People there know their neighbors. They wave from their porches. They mind their business. It's the kind of place where nothing really happens. Until the morning of December 2nd, 2008. That morning, a phone rang inside the Rusk County Emergency Dispatch Center. The person on the other end of the line was a young man, barely 18 years old. His voice was shaking. He sounded confused, maybe scared, and what he said stopped the dispatcher cold. "My name is Blaine Milam, and my daughter. I just found her dead." Just like that, the quiet of Tatum, Texas, was broken. Officers rushed to a trailer home on the edge of town. When they arrived, they found something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Something that none of them had ever seen before, and something that none of them would ever forget. But here's the thing. The story you are about to hear is not just about what happened that morning. It's about the days before it, the people involved, the things they believed, the secrets they kept, and the questions that even after everything was said and done, still don't have easy answers. This is a story about truth and lies, about faith taken too far, about a legal system pushed to its limits, and about a little girl named Amora. If you're new here, and this is your first time watching, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel. True, real, and unlike anything you've seen before. Let's go back to the beginning. Blaine Keith Milam was born on December 12, 1989, in Gregg County, Texas, just a short drive from Rusk County. He grew up in the kind of life that doesn't make headlines. No fancy house, no special story, just a regular kid in a regular town trying to figure things out. In school, Blaine wasn't like most of the other kids. He had a hard time keeping up. He received help for a speech problem, the kind where getting your words out clearly is a daily challenge. Teachers gave him extra support. But beyond that, his school records didn't show anything unusual. No special needs diagnosis. No red flags. He left school early. By the time he was 15 years old, Blaine was already working, holding a job at a place called M&M Express Lube. For 2 years, he worked there. Then he moved on to Big 5 Tire and Auto, where he learned how to fix cars, change tires, run diagnostics, practical work, hands-on stuff. On the outside, Blaine Milam looked like just another young guy in East Texas trying to get by. But there were things about Blaine that most people didn't know, things that would only come to light much later. And by then, it would be too late. Now, let's talk about Jessica. Jessica Bain Carson was also 18 years old at the time. She and Blaine were a couple, more than a couple, actually. They were engaged, planning a future together, living together in a small trailer home near Tatum. Jessica had a daughter. Her name was Amora Bain Carson. Amora was 13 months old, just a baby, a tiny, round-cheeked little girl who was just beginning to discover the world around her. She weighed 23 pounds. She had only recently started making sounds that sounded like words. According to those who knew her, she was a happy child. Blaine called her his daughter. He said her first word was Daddy. The three of them, Blaine, Jessica, and baby Amora, were living together in that trailer. From the outside, it looked like a young family just starting out. But what was happening inside that trailer was something no one on the outside could have imagined. When the officers arrived at the trailer on December 2nd, Blaine and Jessica were both there. They looked upset. They told the police a simple story. They said they had left the trailer for a short time, gone to a pawn shop, and when they came back, they found Amora. That was their story. Simple, sad, a terrible thing, they said. A horrible accident. They didn't know what had happened. But the officers at the scene that morning already knew something wasn't right because what they found inside that trailer did not match what Blaine and Jessica were telling them. Not even close. A medical examiner was called. The results of the examination were so disturbing that the examiner, a man who had been doing this work for over 30 years, said it was the worst thing he had ever seen in his entire career. Think about that for a moment. 30 years of working in that field. Hundreds, maybe thousands of cases, and this one was the worst. But we are not going to tell you everything right now, because the full picture of what happened inside that trailer didn't come out in one day. It came out slowly, piece by piece, in interviews, in courtrooms, in confessions, and some of what came out was so strange, so hard to believe that even experienced investigators had to stop and ask, is this real? Did people actually believe this? The answer was yes. They believed it completely. Here's the first twist in this story. When police pressed Blaine and Jessica, when the simple story started to fall apart, the two of them changed what they were saying. They didn't just change a detail or two. They changed everything. They told investigators that something had been happening with Amora in the days before December 2nd, something that frightened them, something they didn't know how to handle. They said Amora was possessed. They believed, both of them together, that a demon had taken hold of the child, and they said they had tried to help her. They called it an exorcism. Now, before you decide what to think about that, before you make up your mind about these two 18-year-olds standing in a police station explaining why a baby was dead, it's important to understand something. Belief is a powerful thing. It can lead people to do things they would never otherwise do. It can make the impossible seem not just possible, but necessary. It can silence doubt. It can override fear. And in some cases, in the darkest cases, it can make a person feel like they are doing the right thing, even when everything around them says otherwise. Were Blaine and Jessica telling the truth about what they believed? Were they using a story to cover something else? Or was there something in between, something messier and harder to explain? That is the question at the center of this entire story, and it won't be answered in the next 5 minutes, because the truth, if you can call it that, was buried under layers of stories, court records, forensic evidence, and legal arguments that went on for nearly 17 years. 17 years, from the morning of that 911 call to the day the state of Texas said, enough. Before we go further, drop a comment below and tell me, what do you think happened inside that trailer? I want to see your thoughts. Don't scroll past. Tell me what you're thinking right now. And if someone you know needs to hear this story, share it with them. Let's get into it. Let's talk about what investigators found when they really started digging. The medical examiner's report was detailed, clinical. It used the kind of careful, precise language that doctors and scientists use, so they don't have to say the most painful parts out loud. But even in that careful language, the facts were undeniable. Amora had 24 human bite marks on her body. Not from an animal. Human bite marks, covering her from head to toe. She had broken ribs to 18 of them. There was bleeding under her scalp, a lacerated liver, fractures at the back of her skull, a broken arm and leg, and signs of possible strangulation around her neck. The medical examiner concluded this was a homicide. Now, here is where the case begins to get complicated, legally, scientifically, and morally, because a key piece of evidence in this case was those bite marks. Investigators said those bites could be matched, like fingerprints, to a specific person. That matching of bite marks to a suspect is a science called forensic odontology, and in 2008 it was used regularly in courts across the United States. Prosecutors said the bite marks found on Amora matched Blaine Milam. That was a powerful piece of evidence, the kind that shifts a jury's mind in one direction and keeps it there, but here is what you need to remember for later. That science, the idea that bite marks can be reliably matched to a specific person, would one day be called into serious question, not by Blaine's lawyers alone, but by scientists, by legal scholars, by review boards, people who looked at the research and said, "We're not sure this is as solid as we thought." That question, is bite mark evidence actually reliable, would become one of the biggest fights in Blaine Milam's long legal battle, but that fight was still years away. In 2008, all anyone knew was what the evidence showed that day, and what it showed pointed hard in one direction. Blaine Milam was arrested. He was 18 years old. 10 days away from his 19th birthday, Jessica Carson was also arrested. She was 18 years old, too. 2 teenagers, a dead baby, a trailer in East Texas, and a story about demons. The whole county was shaken. The whole state would soon find out. And the legal process, slow, careful, grinding, began to move. Blaine would be charged with capital murder, which in Texas carries one possible sentence if you're found guilty: death. But before any of that, before the courtrooms and the lawyers and the years of appeals, there was a question that everyone in Rusk County was asking. The same question that detectives were asking. The same question that would follow this case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Who really did this? Blaine said it was Jessica. Jessica said it was Blaine. And somewhere in the middle of those two stories was the truth. The trial would not happen for 2 more years. And when it finally did, nothing about it would be simple. Nothing about it would be clean. And the questions it raised, about evidence, about belief, about justice, are questions that people are still arguing about today. What you've heard so far is just the beginning. The real story, the deeper story, is still ahead. The thing about small towns is that everyone talks. In Rusk County, Texas, by December of 2008, everyone already knew the name Blaine Milam. Everyone had heard something, a rumor, a version of the story, a neighbor who knew someone who knew someone. The case was everywhere, in the local papers and conversations at the gas station, at church, at the dinner table. And that is exactly why, when it came time for the trial, the judge made a decision. Blaine Milam would not be tried in Rusk County. The case was moved 140 miles south, all the way to Montgomery County, just outside of Houston. A completely different jury, a completely different pool of people who, in theory, hadn't already made up their minds. The trial began in May 2010, roughly a year and a half after the morning of that 911 call. Blaine Milam sat in the courtroom. He was 20 years old now. No longer the shaking teenager on the phone with the dispatcher. He had spent those months in jail, reading his Bible, he said, thinking, waiting. And now the full weight of the American legal system was pointed directly at him. Trials have a rhythm to them. The prosecution goes first. They lay out their case piece by piece, like building a wall, one brick at a time. Each piece of evidence is another brick. Each witness is another brick. And by the time they are finished, they want that wall to be so high and so solid that the defense can't get through it. In this case, the prosecution had a lot of bricks. The first was the medical examiner's report. The examiner took the stand and walked the jury through his findings. He had been doing this work for over 30 years. He had seen things most people never see and never want to. But he told the court that in all his years, in all his cases, what happened to Amora Carson was the worst thing he had ever witnessed. That statement landed hard in that courtroom. You could feel it. Then came the forensic evidence. Milam's clothing had been examined by a lab, the Southwest Institute of Forensic Sciences. The results showed that several items of his clothing tested positive for biological material connected to Amora. The DNA profile from the child was found to be either a match or consistent with samples taken from Milam's shirt and his jeans. More bricks, but the piece of evidence the prosecution leaned on hardest, the one they kept coming back to, was the bite marks. 24 of them, on a 13-month-old child. And prosecutors brought in a forensic expert to do something that, at the time, was accepted practice in courtrooms all over the country. They asked the expert to match those bite marks to a specific person. The science used to do this is called forensic odontology. It works on a theory that every person's teeth are unique like fingerprints, and that the marks left behind by a bite can be traced back to the person who made them. The expert took the stand. He studied the bite patterns. He compared them to dental impressions taken from Blaine Milam. His conclusion: several of the bite marks on Amora's body were consistent with Milam's teeth. More bricks, but the single most powerful piece of evidence in the entire trial, the one that prosecutors called monumental, didn't come from a lab or a forensic expert. It came from a nurse. Her name was Shirley Broyles. She worked at the Rusk County Jail. She had gotten to know Blaine Milam during the months he spent there, waiting for his trial. She described him as someone she genuinely cared about, someone who seemed lost, someone who had been reading his Bible and talking about his faith. And one day Blaine Milam walked up to her and said something she never forgot. He said, "I'm going to confess. I did it." But Miss Shirley, the Blaine you know, did not do this. "My dad told me to be a man, and I've been reading my Bible. Please tell Jessica that I love her." 5 sentences. That's all it took. When Nurse Shirley Broyles took the stand and repeated those words to the jury, the courtroom went quiet. Prosecutors broke that confession down line by line in their closing argument. They called it unequivocal. They said it was a perfect gold standard confession. Think about what those words mean for a moment. I did it. 3 words. And yet, even in those 3 words, there was something strange, something that didn't quite fit the clean, simple picture the prosecution was painting. But Miss Shirley, the Blaine you know, did not do this. What did that mean exactly? Was that a man taking responsibility? Was it guilt, confusion, fear? Or was it something else, something more complicated, from a young man who didn't fully understand what he was saying or what those words would cost him? That question, what those words really meant, would follow this case for years. Now, the defense. Blaine Milam's lawyers had a difficult job. They were facing a mountain of evidence. A confession, DNA, bite mark analysis. A medical examiner who said it was the worst case he'd ever seen. But they had a strategy. Their first argument was this: Blaine Milam did not act alone. They pointed to Jessica Carson, Amora's own mother. They said she was the one responsible, that she had been in the trailer, that she had knowledge of what was happening, that she was not just a bystander. Their second argument was something that under the law could have changed everything. They argued that Blaine Milam was intellectually disabled. Now, this is important. In 2002, the United States Supreme Court had ruled in a case called Atkins v. Virginia that it is unconstitutional, meaning against the law, to execute someone who is intellectually disabled. The court said that such a person cannot be held to the same level of responsibility as someone without that disability. If Milam was intellectually disabled, he could not legally be put to death. His lawyers presented evidence. They pointed to his IQ scores. Tests came back at 68 and 71. Those numbers are at the border of what is typically considered the range of intellectual disability. His struggles in school, his speech problems as a child, his limited education, his history of drug use. All of it, his lawyers argued, pointed to a man who did not fully understand the world the way most people do. The prosecution fought back. Their expert, Dr. Tim Proctor, took the stand. He argued that Milam's reading comprehension was actually at an 8th grade level, higher than what you typically expect from someone with genuine intellectual disability. He said that factors like anxiety, depression, and drug use could have affected the IQ test results. He concluded that Milam was in the borderline range, below average, yes, but not intellectually disabled. Both sides presented their experts. Both sides made their arguments, and then it was up to the jury. The jury in Montgomery County deliberated. They had heard everything: the medical examiner, the DNA evidence, the bite marks, the confession to the nurse, the arguments about intellectual disability, the competing stories from Blaine and Jessica. They came back with their verdict: guilty, capital murder. And on the question of intellectual disability, they said no. They did not find that Blaine Milam was intellectually disabled, which meant there was only one sentence left to give: death. Blaine Milam was sentenced to die by lethal injection. He was 20 years old. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that most people don't know about. Because most people think that once a jury says guilty and a judge says death, that's the end of the story. The gavel comes down. The case is closed. But in Texas, especially in death penalty cases, that is almost never the end. What follows is a long, slow, complicated process of appeals. Lawyers file documents. Courts review evidence. New questions are raised. Old questions are reopened. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes something surfaces that changes the picture. In Blaine Milam's case, something did surface. Actually more than one thing, and the first thing had to do with those bite marks. Remember how the prosecution's expert said he could match the bite marks on Amora's body to Blaine Milam's teeth? That was 2010. By 2019, 9 years later, the scientific world had started asking very hard questions about bite mark evidence. Researchers, scientists, legal scholars, review boards. They had gone back and looked at hundreds of cases where bite mark analysis had been used as evidence. and what they found was deeply troubling. They found that bite mark evidence was far less reliable than courts had been told, that different experts looking at the same bite marks could reach completely different conclusions, that there was no solid scientific foundation for saying that bite marks could be uniquely matched to a specific person the way fingerprints can. In fact, in Texas, a man named Stephen Chaney had already had his conviction overturned, at least in part, because of problems with bite mark evidence, and Blaine Milam's lawyers took notice. They filed a new appeal. They argued that the bite mark evidence used against their client was based on discredited science, that the jury had been given false information, that if the bite mark testimony was removed from the trial, the outcome might have been different. 8 days before Milam's first scheduled execution date in January 2019, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals did something remarkable. They stopped the execution. Just like that, days before it was supposed to happen. They said the case needed another look, not just because of the bite marks, but also because of the intellectual disability question, which had become even more complicated after a 2017 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that said Texas had been using the wrong method to determine who was intellectually disabled. So the execution was stayed. Blaine Milam went back to death row, and the legal fight continued. If you're still watching, and I know you are, I need you to do one thing right now. Subscribe to this channel, because the next part of this story is where everything really falls apart. Things are about to get much more complicated, and you don't want to miss what comes next. But here is where the story gets truly complicated, because even with the bite marks in question, even with the intellectual disability argument still on the table, the prosecution had one thing that the defense could never fully explain away. That confession. I did it. Those 3 words, spoken to a jail nurse, repeated in court, broken down line by prosecutors, they were always there, always hanging over everything. Milam's lawyers argued that the confession was misunderstood, that a young man with below-average intelligence, sitting in jail, scared and confused, might say something that sounds like a confession without actually meaning what it sounds like. That the words, "the Blaine you know did not do this," suggest he was in some kind of altered state, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. They also noted something else, something that had been there from the very beginning, but had never been fully resolved. Jessica Carson, the mother of Amora, had told investigators that she was in the trailer during the exorcism. She had admitted to being present. She said she watched it happen. She said she did not stop it. A jury in Rusk County later found Jessica guilty of capital murder, but not because she physically hurt Amora herself. Under a Texas law called the law of parties, you don't have to be the one who did something to be held responsible for it. If you were there, if you knew, if you allowed it to happen, that is enough. Jessica Carson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is still serving that sentence today at the Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. And Blaine Milam's lawyers for years and years kept arguing. If Jessica was there, if she admitted being there, if she was convicted of being there, then why is it that the full picture of what happened inside that trailer still wasn't clear? Why were there still unanswered questions? Why, even after 2 trials and years of appeals, did the story still seem incomplete? The answer to that, at least part of it, would come later, when a state expert did something that almost never happens. He changed his mind. Days before Blaine Milam's second scheduled execution date in January 2021, the state's own expert on intellectual disability reversed his earlier opinion. He now said that Milam may, in fact, meet the criteria for intellectual disability. Think about that. The state's own expert, the person who had helped the prosecution argue that Milam should be eligible for the death penalty, changing his opinion days before the execution. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals stopped the execution a second time. Blaine Milam went back to death row again, and a new round of evaluations began. New experts, new testing, new arguments. In a case that had already been going on for 12 years, the questions kept piling up, the answers kept slipping away, and somewhere in a cell in Huntsville, Texas, a man who had once been an 18-year-old kid in a trailer in East Texas was waiting to find out what the law was going to do with him, whether he was intellectually disabled, whether the science used to convict him was sound, whether the confession he gave to a jail nurse meant what the prosecution said it meant, whether justice in this case was truly being served. Those questions, every single one of them, were about to be answered, but not in the way anyone expected. There is something that lawyers and judges talk about that most regular people never hear about. It's called post-conviction review. It sounds complicated, and honestly, the process is. But the idea behind it is simple. It means that after a person is convicted, after the jury says guilty, after the judge says death, the law still allows that person to keep asking questions, to keep challenging what happened, to keep saying, wait, something wasn't right. It is a slow process, a grinding process, a process that can take years, sometimes decades. For Blaine Milam, it took nearly 17 years, and in those 17 years, something extraordinary happened. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate times the ground beneath his conviction began to shake. Let's start with the year 2019. By this point, Blaine Milam had been on death row for 9 years. He had lived through the appeals process, the filings, the hearings, the court orders, the rejections. His lawyers had kept fighting, and in 2019, they brought something new to the table. You remember the bite mark evidence from the trial. The expert who said that the marks on Amora's body matched Blaine Milam's teeth. That testimony had been presented to the jury as science. Hard, reliable, trustworthy science, the kind you can count on. But by 2019, that science was in serious trouble. Researchers and legal experts across the country had been looking closely at forensic bite mark analysis, the practice of matching bite marks to a specific person. And what they were finding was alarming. They found that 2 different experts looking at the exact same bite marks could reach 2 completely different conclusions. They found that there was no universal standard, no agreed-upon method, no solid scientific foundation for saying that bite marks could be matched to one individual person as reliably as fingerprints. In Texas, this had already caused a major reckoning. A man named Stephen Chaney had spent more than 25 years in prison, convicted partly on bite mark evidence. And in 2018, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals did something it almost never does. It declared Chaney actually innocent. It said the bite mark evidence used to convict him had been undermined and, in the court's own words, completely invalidated. Milam's lawyers pointed to this directly. They said, what happened to Stephen Chaney is exactly what happened to our client. The same kind of evidence, the same kind of expert testimony, the same kind of problem. 8 days before Blaine Milam's first scheduled execution date, January 15, 2019, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals stopped the execution. 8 days. Think about that. The court said the case needed another look, not just because of the bite marks, but also because of the question of intellectual disability, which had been reopened by a major U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 2017. That ruling, called Moore v. Texas, said that the method Texas had been using to determine intellectual disability was wrong, that it used outdated standards, that it relied on non-medical factors that had no business being in a court of law, including, believe it or not, at one point, how well a person could lie. The Supreme Court said, "That's not how you determine intellectual disability. Use the clinical standards. Use the science, not your own invented rules." And so Blaine Milam's case went back to the trial court, back to the experts, back to the beginning of that question. Is this man intellectually disabled? The re-evaluation began. The state brought in a new expert, their first expert, to take another look at Milam using the updated standards from the Supreme Court ruling. That expert's name was Dr. Tim Proctor. He was the same expert who had testified at the original trial, the same man who, in 2010, had told the jury that Milam was not intellectually disabled. But this time, something changed. In January 2021, days before Milam's second scheduled execution date, Dr. Tim Proctor submitted a new report. In it, he reversed his earlier opinion. He now said that under the current clinical standards, the proper, updated, medically sound standards, Blaine Milam did, in fact, meet the criteria for intellectual disability. The state's own expert, the same man who helped send Milam to death row, changing his mind. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals stopped the execution a second time. For the second time in 2 years, Blaine Milam came within days of being executed and was pulled back. Now, you might think that would be the end of it, that when the state's own expert changes his mind and says the man meets the criteria for intellectual disability, the legal bar that protects a person from execution, that would settle things, but that is not what happened because the state was not finished. They went out and found another expert, a different one, someone who looked at the same evidence, the same IQ scores, the same history, the same data, and reached a different conclusion. This new expert argued that Milam was not intellectually disabled. He pointed to what he called an isolated strength, specifically the fact that Milam could read at an 8th grade level. He used a partial IQ score rather than the full score, and based on that, he said, "Not intellectually disabled." Milam's lawyers were furious. They brought in 4 medical professionals to review the new expert's work. All 4 said the same thing. The methodology was wrong. The expert had not followed proper clinical standards. He had used one isolated strength to rule out a diagnosis that required looking at the whole picture. Medical experts from across the country agreed. Reading at an 8th grade level, roughly the level of a 13 or 14-year-old, is not what you would call a sign of full adult functioning. And more importantly, a single strength does not cancel out an intellectual disability diagnosis. People with intellectual disabilities have both strengths and weaknesses. That is not unusual. That is normal. Major disability rights organizations joined the fight. The ARC of the United States, The Arc of Texas. Disability Rights Texas. The American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. All of them filed formal legal briefs urging the courts to follow clinical standards, not invented ones, not shortcuts, not stereotypes. Their message was clear: if you're going to decide whether to execute someone, you had better get this right. The courts kept reviewing. The trial court eventually sided with the state's second expert, the one who said Milam was not disabled. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed, and so the road to a third execution date was open. That date was set for September 25, 2025, but by the time that date arrived, Blaine Milam's lawyers weren't just fighting the intellectual disability question anymore. They had found something else, something that, if true, changed the entire picture of this case. Go back to that trial in 2010. The prosecution had three main pillars of forensic evidence: the bite mark analysis, the blood pattern analysis, and the DNA. The bite marks, as we've discussed, were now widely considered junk science. By 2023, there was a formal scientific consensus in Texas that bite mark testimony in any form was no longer admissible in Texas courts. Not just unreliable, inadmissible. Meaning, if this trial were held today, that expert would not even be allowed to take the stand. The blood pattern analysis, the third expert, who testified about how the blood at the scene was distributed, was also being challenged as unreliable. But it was the DNA evidence that produced the most jaw-dropping development. The DNA testing in Milam's case had been performed by a laboratory called the Southwest Institute of Forensic Sciences, known as SWIFS. At trial, SWIFT's employees testified that Milam's DNA had been found on Amora's injuries. That was powerful. That was the kind of evidence that sticks with a jury nut here, is what Milam's lawyers discovered. Back in March 2016, 4 years before Milam's first execution was even scheduled, SWIFS had quietly sent a notice to the state. In that notice, the lab said that the method they had used to interpret the DNA mixtures in Milam's case was outdated and unreliable. They recommended the evidence be reinterpreted, and they specifically said the state should inform Milam of this. The state did not inform Milam, not in 2016, not in 2017, not in 2018, not when they were fighting his first appeal, not when they were fighting his second, not at any point during those long years of litigation. Milam only found out about that 2016 notice in August 2025, 1 month before his scheduled execution. And in that same month, August 2025, SWIFS did something remarkable. The lab officially retracted its DNA testimony from the 2010 trial. Not adjusted it, not updated it, retracted it, meaning the DNA evidence that prosecutors had used to connect Blaine Milam to Amora's injuries, evidence that juries had heard, that courts had cited, that had been used to keep him on death row for 15 years, was now being walked back by the very lab that produced it. The state's own lab. The state's own science? Gone. Milam's lawyers moved fast. They filed emergency appeals. They went to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. They went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They argued that no man should be executed when the key forensic evidence used to convict him had been retracted, when the bite mark science had been declared junk, when his own mental capacity was genuinely in question. They argued that Blaine Milam might actually be innocent, not just that the evidence was weak, not just that the process was flawed, actually innocent. That is one of the most powerful arguments you can make in a court of law, and one of the hardest to win, because the legal system moves slowly, and courts are cautious about throwing out convictions, even when the evidence underneath them starts to crumble. The Fifth Circuit denied authorization. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals dismissed the claims. And then, on September 23, 2025, just 2 days before his scheduled execution, Milam's lawyers did the only thing left to do. They went to the United States Supreme Court. They filed an emergency petition, a request for a stay of execution. They laid out everything: the retracted DNA, the junk bite mark science, the intellectual disability, the hidden 2016 notice, and they said, "Please, stop. Look at this." The clock was ticking. September 25, 2025, was approaching, and the 9 justices of the Supreme Court of the United States had to decide. Now, here is something worth sitting with for a moment. This is the part of the story that people rarely think about when they think about the death penalty. Most people think about the crime, the facts of what happened, and in this case those facts are not in dispute. A 13-month-old child was killed. A baby, a little girl named Amora, who, by all accounts, had never done anything wrong to anyone. Nobody argues that what happened to her was acceptable. Nobody is asking for that to be forgotten. But the question the legal system is being asked, the question it has been wrestling with for 17 years, is a different one. It is not, was a terrible thing done? It is, did we identify the right person beyond all reasonable doubt? Did we use reliable evidence? Did we follow the rules that protect everyone, including the accused? Did we get this right? Those are the questions Milam's lawyers kept raising, and those are the questions that, as the clock ticked toward September 25th, still did not have a clean answer. The Supreme Court was the last stop. Whatever they decided would be final. September 25th, 2025. The date had been circled for months. By lawyers, by courts, by journalists, by the people who had followed this case for years, by the people who had never forgotten the name Amora Carson, and by Blaine Milam himself. He had been here before, twice. He had sat in a cell on death row and watched an execution date approach. And twice, at the last possible moment, something had happened to pull him back. A court order, a new question, a stay. But this time felt different. This time every door had been tried. Every argument had been made. Every court had been asked. And one by one, every single one of them had said no. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted on Tuesday, September 22nd. Their decision was unanimous: no clemency, no reduction in sentence, no mercy. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied his final state petition the same day, not on the merits of his claims, but on procedural grounds, meaning they didn't even fully examine the evidence he had raised. They dismissed it on a technicality, and so the only door left was the one in Washington, D.C., the United States Supreme Court. Milam's lawyers filed their emergency petition to the Supreme Court on September 23rd, 2 days before the execution. The document they submitted laid out everything, every crack in the case, every piece of evidence that had been questioned, challenged, or outright retracted. They told the court, the bite mark testimony used to convict this man is now considered junk science, not just by defense experts, but by the scientific community at large. In Texas, as of 2023, that kind of testimony is no longer even admissible in court. They told the court the DNA evidence, which the state used to place Milam at the scene of the crime, had been retracted by the very lab that produced it in August 2025, just 1 month before the execution date. They told the court the blood pattern analysis had come from an expert who was not affiliated with an accredited lab and who did not follow proper scientific methods. And they said, take all 3 of those pillars away, and what is left? They said, a confession that a young man with a below-average IQ gave to a jail nurse. Words spoken informally without a lawyer present, in an emotionally charged moment, by someone who, in the very same breath, said that the Blaine you know did not do this. They said, this man may be actually innocent. And they asked the court for one thing, not freedom, not an overturned conviction, just time, a temporary stay of execution. Enough time to let the courts properly examine what the retracted DNA evidence and the discredited forensic science actually meant for this case. The state of Texas pushed back. The Texas Attorney General's office argued that even if you removed the bite mark evidence and the DNA testimony, even if you took both of those completely off the table, there was still enough to convict Blaine Milam. They pointed to the confession, the words spoken to Nurse Shirley Broyles. I did it. They pointed to other physical evidence found at the scene. Court documents show that a pipe wrench was among the items that investigators connected to the case. They argued that Milam's intellectual disability claims had already been reviewed and rejected by multiple courts using proper legal standards, that his lawyers were raising the same arguments again and again, dressed in new language, hoping something would finally stick. They argued that the families of victims have rights too, that justice delayed in a case this clear is justice denied, and they said this execution should proceed. The Supreme Court considered the petition, and on the afternoon of September 25, 2025, the day of the scheduled execution, the court made its decision. They denied the application. No stay, no delay, no additional review. The 9 justices of the highest court in the United States looked at everything Milam's lawyers had put in front of them, the retracted DNA, the junk science, the intellectual disability question, the claim of actual innocence, and they said, no, that was it. The last door had closed. At 6:19 in the evening, the process began at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, a place known simply as the Walls Unit, a red brick building that has been the site of more executions than anywhere else in the United States. A lethal dose of a sedative called pentobarbital began flowing through in 4-line into Blaine Milam's right hand and left arm. He was 35 years old. The same person who had made that 911 call 17 years earlier, shaking, barely 18, standing in a trailer in East Texas, was now lying on a gurney in a room where the walls were white and the air was quiet. 2 minutes after the injection began, he made a sound once, then went still. All movement stopped. At 6:40 in the evening, Blaine Keith Milam was pronounced dead. He was the 5th person executed by the state of Texas in 2025, the 596th person executed in Texas since 1982. But before all of that, before the injection, before the stillness, Blaine Milam had been given the chance to say something. In Texas, every person facing execution is allowed a final statement. Some people use that moment to express anger. Some express regret. Some say nothing at all. Blaine Milam used his final words to talk about the people who had stood by him during 15 years on death row. The supporters, the letter writers, the advocates who had fought for him from the outside. He thanked the prison chaplaincy program, a faith-based program that had been opened to death row inmates, for helping him find what he called Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. And then he said this: "If any of you would like to see me again, I implore all of you, no matter who you are, to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and we will meet again. I love you all. Bring me home, Jesus." Those were his last words. He did not express remorse. He did not mention Amora. He did not say he was sorry. Outside, the prosecutor who had tried the original case, Rusk County District Attorney Michael Jimerson, had watched the execution. He had been present in the room. Afterward, he said this: "We will never know what Amora would have contributed to our world." Answering the call for justice for the most helpless is a measure of a civilized people. Two very different statements from two men who had been tied to this case for 17 years. One about faith and reunion. One about a little girl who never got to grow up. Now we have to sit with the full picture, because this story, as you have heard it across these past chapters, is not a simple one. It never was. There are things in this case that are not in dispute. A 13-month-old child named Amora Carson died on or before December 2nd, 2008. She suffered terribly. She was alone and helpless. She could not protect herself. She could not call for help. She could not tell anyone what was happening to her. Whatever the full truth of that night is, whatever the exact sequence of events inside that trailer, Amora was failed by the adults who were supposed to keep her safe. That is not in dispute. What is in dispute, and what has been in dispute for 17 years, is everything else. Who exactly did what? How much each person knew? How much each person did? And whether the evidence used to make that determination was reliable enough to stake a human life on. Those are the questions that Blaine Milam's lawyers kept raising, and the courts, in the end, kept answering the same way. Not enough. The conviction stands. The sentence stands, but here is what makes this story linger. In August 2025, just weeks before the execution, the state's own forensic lab retracted its DNA testimony. The same lab that had helped send Blaine Milam to death row 15 years earlier walked back what it had said. That DNA retraction did not save him. In 2023, the scientific community reached a formal consensus that bite mark testimony, the smoking gun the prosecution had pointed to at trial, is junk science, inadmissible in Texas courts today. That consensus did not save him. 2 of his execution dates were stopped by courts that said, "Wait, something needs a second look." Those stays eventually ran out. And a man who maintained his innocence to the very end, who said in his first confession that the Blaine you know did not do this, went to his death without those questions ever being fully resolved in a court of law. Before we close, if this story made you think, if it stayed with you, if it raised questions you're still turning over in your mind, that's what we do here. Subscribe to this channel, because every story we tell is like this one, real, complicated, and impossible to forget. We do the research so you don't have to. Stick with us. There is one final thing worth saying. The legal system is built by human beings. It is run by human beings. And like everything human beings build, it is imperfect. It has rules to protect the innocent, rules about evidence, rules about how science should be used in court, rules about who can and cannot be executed. Those rules exist for a reason. And sometimes, in cases like this one, those rules are tested, stretched, questioned, and the answers that come back are not always satisfying. Jessica Carson is still alive. She is serving her sentence at the Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Life without the possibility of parole. She will likely die in prison. Blaine Milam is gone. Executed on a Thursday evening in September in a quiet room in Huntsville, Texas. And Amora Carson, the one at the center of all of it, never got to be more than 13 months old. She never got to take more than her first few steps, never got to say more than her first few words, never got to find out who she was going to become. That is the truest, most undeniable fact in this entire story. Whatever you believe about what happened, whatever you believe about the evidence, whatever you believe about the justice system and whether it got this right, Amora deserved better than what she got. She deserved to be safe. She deserved to grow up, and she didn't get either. This has been the story of Blaine Milam, of a case that started with a phone call in a small town in East Texas and ended 17 years later in a death chamber in Huntsville. A case built on a confession, on science that was later called into question, on a legal system that had to weigh competing truths against each other and make a final, irreversible decision. Some people believe justice was served on September 25, 2025. Some people believe something else happened that night, and some people, maybe you, are somewhere in between. Still thinking, still asking questions. That's okay. The best stories don't always have clean endings. This one certainly doesn't.